What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This is episode number 309. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources, and joining me on the line, wrapped up in blankets in Denver, it's Luis Scott-Vargas. LSV, how you feeling, sir?
I'm doing all right. We're recording this the day before I'm set to leave for GP Seattle, and I guess you're set to be there. And like I told you, I'm about 85% to go, so we'll see if I feel better tomorrow.
I hope you do, and I'm glad that you were feeling well enough to do the show, because we've got a pretty important one tonight and a big kind of level up topic that we're going to be covering. We're going to cover sideboarding tonight. Before we do, I want to mention our sponsor, channelfireball.com. You can go to Channel Fireball to pick up any of the singles or sealed product that you need to play our great game. But there's also more. You can find free content. That's right. Completely free videos, podcasts, articles, write-ups, everything from some of the best players in the world. And also, if you're like me and you draft a lot, you end up with kind of a pile of rares, and that pile of rares can grow. And I give some of them away on the show, the ones that we do for the Crack-A-Pack, but the ones I do when I'm drafting on the side just kind of pile up. And what you can do is you can sell them. You can sell them back to Channel Fireball. And if you do, and if you want store credit for them, you can get cash. But if you'd like store credit, you'll get 30% bonus on what you sell back to them. That means you can roll that right back into things for. You can get sealed product with it and draft some more. You can find some sweet singles to fill out your Commander or Canadian Highlander deck or whatever, or just some stuff for standard, whatever it is that you happen to need. And you're going to get a really sizable bonus, 30% on store credit. So that's a great option and a really good way to get rid of those rares that kind of pile up. And make sure you do it in a timely fashion. You don't want to get caught on the standard rotation where you've kind of just sat on these things for a while, then the bottom falls out on them. You want to make sure that you move those when you get them. The show is also brought to you by you. Patreon is the way that you can support the show directly. You get a whole bunch of perks. I've been working on one of the main perks all day or half the day today with to no avail. I'm still working on how to figure out.
Is this the cookies you were baking? Because that's what delayed the show.
No, that took up a much smaller portion of time. And by the way, this is one of the worst ideas I've ever had, because they're sitting about 8 feet from me, and like that cookie smell is in my condo, and like I can't go over there and eat them without interrupting the show. And I don't know why I did that, but I did. But anyway, a bunch of cool perks you can get on the Patreon, and you also get signed up for our giveaways. We give away the cards from the Crack-A-Pack along with an LR gift pack once every about month or so, along with some other extra giveaways that I'll throw in from time to time. Another thing that you get is you get to submit questions for the Patreon question of the week. We've got one here from Carl Radel, who says, after having success with a particular archetype, Blue-White Flyer / Awaken, several drafts in a row, I found myself having tunnel vision when it comes to drafting the next time around. Any tips on how I can zoom out on the set when I'm in this position? And I like this question a lot from Carl, because I guarantee he is not alone in feeling this way. I think this is actually kind of a natural thing. It's how your brain adapts to new situations. It will find its comfort zone and tend to kind of settle in that area. And Luis and I are big proponents of trying out new things when the set first comes out and being pretty adventurous with the rares specifically, but also with the different archetypes as they come out. But it can be hard. It can be a challenge to, you look at that pack and you've won a couple of drafts with Blue-White Flyers, and, you see one of the decent cards for that. And maybe there's some other stuff that you haven't played with that looks pretty interesting, but you're just like, I'm just going to take this good white card. I know it's good. I know I can win with it. Why change it? Right. And, it's easy to fall into that rut, only to find yourself a little while later only with the knowledge on how to draft one of the archetypes really well. But when the other ones are open, you're giving up a lot of value. You're the one who is kind of floundering around trying to figure it out weeks into the format, where everybody else who took those risks and pushed the boundaries a little bit, is benefiting from the fact that they did so. So, Luis, how do you break out of that mentality of kind of finding a default position in a draft format and getting out of that?
Well, the long answer is actually listen to our podcast on the 11 biggest traps in Limited, because this was one of them. This was when you draft a particular archetype or deck too often, you start naturally valuing those cards higher. And I think that's what Carl's exactly saying. It's like, well, Clutch of Currents is pretty great. I guess I'll take, Clutch of Currents maybe over like something like Vile Aggregate, because I'm really happy whenever I take this card. And then you just end up forcing a deck. So a way to break out of that is, first, you can do the opposite of what we do sometimes. Sometimes we advocate forcing a deck so that you learn it. The opposite of that is forcing yourself not to draft Blue-White Flyers. That way you can kind of recalibrate reset yourself. Sometimes, we've talked about this before, later in the format especially, you'll get into these routines where you end up drafting the same deck or a couple decks too often because that's all you draft. One way I found to recalibrate is just do a couple drafts where I'm just intentionally avoiding the thing I draft too often, and then try to normalize my pick orders and my values, because for a while, I will overvalue the cards that go into a particular deck.
Yeah, for sure. A couple other points I wanted to make for Carl was, one, good for you, Carl. The really important hurdle here is that you've realized that this isn't the right way to approach it, right? That there is more to a draft format than just learning one archetype and hammering on it. And that's really a big hurdle because a lot of people don't. They just sit there and do the same thing over and over and over. And eventually when they're forced to shift, they don't really know what they're doing. So thumbs up for that, Carl. Nice job in being self-aware. That's a big step. More to it, talking about what you were just saying, Luis, about figuring out like how to push in a different direction. One of the cool things is that saying you're not going to draft one archetype isn't nearly as bad as saying I'm going to draft one archetype, because there's going to be, call it 5 or 6 other archetypes that you can aim for. And sure, even if your seat maybe really wanted to be blue-white, you're going to find a home somewhere else, where if you commit really hard to one archetype and force that, and it's not there, then you're kind of screwed because you're just taking mediocre cards over cards that you really should be taking. So don't be afraid to do it. You're not giving up as much value as you think. I think that, our thought process on the show is that, your absolute peak optimal is to be completely open and be able to draft all the archetypes. But that takes time. You have to build up that skill and you have to kind of learn these things. And I think that saying you're not going to draft one, while is not perfect draft strategy, it's a lot better than saying I'm only going to draft this one archetype. Okay, crack a pack. This comes from Daniel Nilsson. I think he was in Quebec City.
That reminds me of the last time I heard packs getting opened.
Oh God, where were we, by the way? I just had a flashback.
You were in the booth at GP Indy doing
it was
coverage,
an Indy,
and you were on air too.
I was on air, and I see Luis come trotting up, and I'm like, oh hey, it's Luis. I had seen him maybe once earlier, and kind of gave him a wave, and he just stands there and he lifts up a pack, and I'm like, oh come on! I'm like trying to commentate a match, and he opens it. And he looks through it and then drops all the cards on the ground. I'm just like, what is this guy doing? And then the best part is watching you pick them back up.
Well, I don't actually. It would have been much more dramatic if I just, dropped it, and then just walked out. But that would have actually bothered me.
Yeah, that would have been too much spew even for you. All right, our first card is Tajuru Stalwart.
A key card in the Converge archetype, but not one I'm going to first pick.
Yeah, I agree. And I have found it, thumbs up, the 3/4 on the ground really does do good work. But yeah, you need to make that thing work a little harder, and you want to pick them up later. Incubator Drone, the 2/3 for 4, and you get a 1/1 Eldrazi. This card is just, I started it out as fine, and it's sort of remained fine for me. It's never been a priority, but I often find myself with one of these in my build. I like the fact that it's effectively a 3/4 for 4 mana. I like the fact that it gives me 2 blockers if I'm trying to attack in the air, and I like the fact that it gives me a little bit of ramp occasionally too. That being said, same thing. It's just not a priority. You can pick this up kind of whenever and maybe run one of them, maybe not. Stonehaven Medic.
This is, the first 3 cards we've seen are like role players in decks. I guess the start would be slightly higher, but they're all role players, and the Medic is in black-white life gain, but none of these cards are cards you want to take early. Basically, if you're taking these early, the deck isn't necessarily open. If you're getting them 7th pick, then maybe you're in the right place.
Yeah. Volcanic Upheaval, not playable. Tightening Coils.
This card has moved up in my estimation.
Yeah,
it's, I called it Terminate as a joke, but it's actually just Terminate. So
no, it's still not just Terminate. Oh man, I had the misfortune of putting this on a Blood Bond vampire just because it was going to get out of hand, and then it ended up getting out of hand anyway. It just took a lot longer, but yeah, it doesn't solve all your problems, but the card's good. And especially, I can't emphasize this enough, it goes so well in the Blue-White Flyers deck. It does everything that you want in that deck. It prevents your opponent from racing you on the ground, and it gets blockers out of the air if they happen to put a flyer up. It's just really, really good in that deck. Eldrazi Devastator, that's the 8/9 trample for 8. Really just not been super impressed by this one. I think it's a little bit of a shortcoming of the format perhaps, but casting big 8-drops like this kind of hasn't really been a thing for me. I found a spot here or there to do it. The Hedron archives go a long way to make things like this come into focus. But even then, I find myself stopping at 7 mana more often than not. And I haven't really found, I think it was supposed to be the green deck, right? Like that one lets you have a whole lot of Eldrazi Scions to pump these things out. But as it turns out, green is the weakest color in the format. Even if that's been overstated perhaps a bit by some of the pros, I do think it is still the weakest, and that means that cards like Eldrazi Devastator just aren't on my radar really at all.
Yeah, that sounds like a potential good topic for an upcoming show, by the way, just not to foreshadow too much, but there are some pretty long threads in actually the LRcast forum, and it's an interesting subject, but we'll get to that at some point later maybe.
Yeah, and by the way, we should mention that too. I have it in the show notes every time just for people to find it. But we do have a subreddit. That's where the forum exists for limited resources listeners and people that are into the kind of things that you or I into value, into thinking about things from a critical perspective, into improving, into being open minded, and trying to move things forward for yourself and for the community. We've got a really nice group there that they will give you feedback. I had a few people ask on the stream the other night, hey, I've got a draft. Can somebody take a look at it? And they were like, go to the subreddit and you will get feedback on it. And sometimes people write big, elaborate feedback for you and good discussions over there. And I definitely recommend checking that out. Demon's Grasp.
Yeah. Moderate removal. Like we talk about how removal's gotten worse. Demon's Grasp is removal getting even worse than that.
Yeah.
It's sorcery speed. This card is just not very good. So
yeah, I have it in the necessary evil camp for removal. I do run it. Like it's not like I don't not play this card if I have, like the first one often makes the cut if I'm in black. It's just like, it does kill things that you need to kill. It's just not really the way you want to be doing it.
I have it in the jovial evil camp for those who like cards from Legends.
Jovial evil?
It's a card from Legends.
I'm going to look that up later. Looming Spires. That's the red land. Yeah, whatever.
I like Looming Spires. I think this might be my favorite one, actually. Just because the red deck is the deck that wants this. It's the deck that has Slab Hammer in it. But it's just not a card you can take first pick. Like, so far, I'm on Team Tightening Coils, I guess.
Yeah, me too. But I'm really hoping that we're going to improve that.
No, that would be a pretty miserable first pick.
Right. Fertile Thicket, excuse me. So the green version.
Yeah, which is a fine card, but nothing I'm too excited about.
Well, let's see if the uncommons bail us out. Grove Tender Druids is our first uncommon.
So this does play well in the green-white ally decks because it does... Well, it's an ally, first of all. Second of all, it gives you a bunch of tokens, which is exactly what the deck wants to do. But I'm not really stoked about first picking this. I haven't loved green-white that much, and I think I would rather just take Tightening Coils first pick over a 2-color card in a combination I'm not really looking to draft.
Yeah, the card...
It's funny, because I would have never done that the first week it came out.
Right.
Like, Green Reward Druids is just like a much more powerful card, like if you just look at it.
No, it's weird. It's been a weird ride for Grove Tender Druids for me because, like, on one hand, I looked at it, and the first time I saw it, I thought, God, that's clunky, right? Like, you're spewing out plant tokens, you're not spewing out allies. You have to pay an extra mana. So, like, if you wait till turn 5, you can play this and then pay an extra mana and get a 3/3 and a 1/1 plant, which is okay. It's a fine deal. There's nothing really to complain about with it, but it has actually performed better than I thought it would. But at the same time, I'm the same. I'm not willing to first pick it. So it's like in this weird middle ground. Retreat to Hagra. That's the black retreat. So a creature, when you have landfall creature, you can get +1/+1 death touch until end of turn, or you can drain your opponent for 1.
This is kind of like, it's kind of like the medic, the Stonehaven medic, where it's an enabler for the life gain deck, but not one that you should be starting on.
Right. Yeah. And even then it's like not great. Blighted Gorge. Wow. This pack has been really bad. This is the red blighted land. So 4 and a red, tap it, sack it to do 2 damage to a creature or player. Again, it's perfectly serviceable, but just shrug worthy, right? I don't know. This doesn't really get me
It's funny that we thought these lands were going to be really good when we did the set review.
Yeah.
They look great. I mean, lands that do things in addition to just tapping for mana tend to be very good, and these effects look good. But yeah, I've been very underwhelmed by these lands.
What happened? I still look at them and read them and think that's good. I even look at this one and think that's good. But then like I play them not that often. And when I do, I'm not that impressed by them.
I think it's because this format has a lot of stuff you can do in the late game, and that's when these sort of effects are good. That's my theory, at least.
All right, we've got a rare.
I would hope so.
Oh. All right, well, we'll start with this. We've got a rare. It's really good. It's Guardian of Tazim.
All right, well.
So 3 blue for a 4/5. Fly and landfall. Tap down a creature. If it's an island, keep it tapped for a turn.
Guardian seems just one of the best cards in the set. You'll never pass it if you open it, assuming there's not multiple rares in the same pack. So this is a pretty easy Guardian, which, makes me think that whoever we're passing this pack to is not going to have a good time. They're probably going to take either Titan Coils if they have a card that goes well with blue, or they'll take one of the just mediocre cards.
I might have to interrupt you there.
What's that?
If we're windmilling Guardian of Tazim and passing this pack, I can tell you that the person to our left is going to be quite pleased.
Oh.
Because we got another card in here.
Nice slow rolls.
There is a Steam Vents in this pack.
I see.
Which is kind of insane because this is actually, I've now opened 2 expeditions and they're both Steam Vents.
I opened 0 expeditions. Also, Marshall didn't really open the Steam Vents in the pack. We talked about this before the show. He just wanted to make people sign up.
People are going to think that anyway. By the way, apologies to Daniel Nilsson who gave me the pack. But yes, we opened a Steam Vents. Holy crap. Awesome. Dude, this thing is gorgeous too.
So realistically, if you're cracking this pack at like an F&M, you should take the Steam Vents. I mean,
yes.
Let's just...
Hold on, I got to get the sleeve. That's ridiculous.
What did you say?
Get the sleeve, I said. I'm getting it right now. All right.
I don't know if anyone's a fan of Kenji Nuwatanami, but that is one of his catchphrases.
All right, now I'm going to go all LR on you here. So what do you take at the PT? You just take Guardian and move on?
Guardian Tazim.
It's really good, right?
Okay, look, there's 2 things. First of all, I think if you actually did, like, assuming this is draft 1 or 0-0, I think if you actually looked at your, like, equity in the tournament, given the prize structure, Guardian Tazim is worth more money than Steam Vents.
Probably, yeah.
And then
it's gorgeous. Like, I'm holding it right now. My hand is kind of shaking. The thing is beautiful.
But second of all, I mean, not to dredge up this whole discussion again, but when I go to these tournaments, I go there because I want to do well in the tournament, not because I want to hope to open an expedition and cover my, my hotel room for a night or whatever. Though that changes if you make day 2 at 4-4 and then you open a polluted Delta. You really got to look at that pack. So I'm not saying I'm blind to what these cards are worth.
Yeah, you're not blind to it, but you're still going to run the numbers on it. Well, this is awesome. I've got the Steam Vents in a sleeve, and 2 things. One, we give these away, so this will go to a listener on the next giveaway, or a patron, I should say. And also, I'm really curious to see, one thing I do every time, Luis, is I put the cards from the pack up on a straw poll that goes on the LR blog on lrcast.com. And I'm curious to see what everybody at home thinks, if they're just windmilling the Steam Vents or not.
Come on, they're good at windmill Steam Vents.
We'll see. Maybe we got some hardcore out there that are like, nah, don't need it. Take the Guardian. Ooh, that's cool. I'm really happy about that. I'm not going to lie. I was really hoping we had opened one. And then if we didn't open one, I was going to buy one and just be like, I'm throwing it in or whatever. Just because like, I would think it would just be really cool to give one away, but yeah, it looks like we ran hot here. So that's awesome. And that card is gorgeous. Again, weird, right? I have 2 of them now. At least for a little while.
You just keep rubbing it in that I've never opened an expedition. Probably never.
Fine. I'm fine with it. That's just karma for all those packs you just.
Well, I was supposed to open those packs to fight an expedition.
Yeah, but you're not going to get good luck if you open them up in just like a wasteful manner like that. Come on, you got to know how this works. Okay, moving on. It's time for our main topic. We're going to talk sideboarding today, and sideboarding is absolutely one of the things that you can use to level up your game. It can make you a lot better at limited. It's probably something you're not paying enough attention to. I think that the vast majority of limited players do not pay attention enough to sideboarding, at sideboarding, excuse me. This is a huge flexible tool that you have optionally available to you, and you should use it. So let's get into it. What do we want to start off with first here, Luis? How do we get into sideboarding?
So I want to preface this by saying you will likely have heard some of these things before, because this is a pretty big topic. It's also one that certainly visited before, and you have also visited before, even before my tenure on the show.
Yeah.
So if some of these things sound familiar, that's fine. I mean, that is just nature of the beast. I guess getting into it, I think the biggest thing is, first of all, we're going to talk about both draft and sealed, and just because people keep asking this, next week we're going to do our episode about sealed. I think that'll be the timing will line up right because I'll have played more sealed by next week.
Yeah, and we're leading up to Grand Prix Atlanta, which is I know a lot of players are going to be playing in that. So we'll have that out the week before to give you an idea for those of you that are going to the GP.
So what we're going to talk about today applies to both draft and sealed, and when we are talking about a specific, one of the specific formats, then we'll be sure to mention it. But a lot of this is applicable to both. And the biggest thing is, don't think of your sideboard as a couple cards you can bring in, especially in sealed. Think of it as your goal for games 2 and 3 or 4, if you draw a game, because who knows, is to build the best deck you can out of your entire pool. And what that means is that the deck you registered has no bearing on that. Sometimes you'll even end up with a draft like this where you will switch colors, you'll switch strategies, you'll make big changes. In sealed, you'll switch decks completely. You really shouldn't be looking at like, all right, what can I take out and what can I put in? It's more like, let's just build the best deck we can build. And once you think about it like that, I think you end up in a lot better space because you're not limited by your first deck. And yeah, I mean, in a draft, if you drafted black-white and you've got not very many, black and white cards in your sideboard, you have a couple random other colors in your sideboard, you're probably not switching out. You drafted this deck. But sometimes you can sideboard 7 or 8 cards, if not more, in limited. And that's, something in draft, that's something I've done many times. So you really have to just think of sideboarding more as like kind of the holistic view of just looking at all the cards you have access to, because you play more sideboarded games than you play unsideboarded games. But people just don't think about it. They think of sideboarding as an afterthought. Like, I've seen people all the time not look through their sideboards after game 1, which...
Oh, I've seen that too.
Which is kind of insane to me because after game 1, you should be looking at what upgrades you can make, what things you can shift. And if you're not really even thinking about sideboarding, I think you're going to really impact your win percentage. For a lot of people, getting better at sideboarding is one of the best ways to just have a higher win percentage.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we want to hit on here as well, and this is how I like to look at sideboarding, and I think you mentioned it particularly in sealed, but this is definitely true of draft as well, just to a lesser degree, which is that I look at things in terms of an environment, right? And what I mean by that is kind of a sealed off subset of cards, basically, when it comes to Magic. And what you're really doing is really interesting, because when you build a sealed pool or draft a deck, and then build it, what you're doing is you're saying, I think that this list of cards, it's what's going to give me the best chance to win against the entire subset of playable cards in the set. So take the unplayables out, those you're not going to factor in. The completely unplayables. But everything else, you're basically factoring in when you build your deck, and you're saying, this is the subset of cards that is going to give me the best chance against the average of all of that. The thing is, after you play a game of Magic against somebody, you are not dealing with that same environment. Your subset of cards is no longer the playable cards in the set. It is now narrowed drastically. First off, you get to see what colors your opponent's playing. Oftentimes they'll be playing 2 colors. So now 3/5 of all of the cards plus some other stuff probably is out. And that means that if you looked at the limited environment as just those 2 colors plus the colorless cards in the lands, all of a sudden that limited environment looks a lot different, and you may attack it from a different angle. Now, and on top of that, the fact that you've got to see a decent percentage of the cards from your opponent's deck. Even in a relatively quick game, it's not uncommon to see 5, 6, or 7 cards from your opponent. Just spells that they've cast, creatures, whatever it is, that, not counting basic lands. And if you were just to write those down, you got to realize that in this format, we're often playing 18 lands. If you see 7 spells, you've seen almost a third of their entire deck in one game. And sometimes the game goes long and you see 10 or 11 or even 12 spells. Sometimes you'll have seen the majority of the spells in their deck. And now let's take that to the next game. Let's say you make it to a game 3. All of a sudden, there are scenarios where you've seen the vast majority of their deck, or maybe even the whole thing. You might know every card in their deck or close to it. And if I walked up to you when you were building your sealed pool or building your draft deck, and I said, the environment that you're trying to beat is no longer every card in the set that's playable. Instead, it's these 22 cards or maybe 23 cards or whatever it is, you would probably build your deck differently as a result. You would probably say, oh, well, if that's all I need to beat, then I don't need to Smite the Monstrous because I don't have to worry about big stuff because the deck that you just showed me doesn't have big stuff. So that's not going to be in my deck. I'm not going to worry about that. And, this cheap blocker that is kind of inefficient against, medium to big creatures, but really good against small creatures. Well, I would put that in for sure. And all of a sudden you start making these changes and you feel pretty confident about it because you know that the subset of cards you need to beat is so much smaller and so much more defined than that big one. And that's kind of how you should view sideboarding. Now, the fact is that you are going to be limited to how much stuff you can actually change. So it's not like you get to just completely flip everything on its head. So what ends up happening in reality is that while you are adjusting for that subset of cards, it's usually not quite as pronounced, though it can be, especially in sealed. But usually it ends up being some percentage of what you can do to change it. But all of those points count. I mean, every percentage point you get counts no matter if you got it out of your sideboard. If you took a bad card out and put a good card in, that's a huge swing for you. And you need to be thinking about this in terms of this is our little world that I need to beat now. And it's not the thing that I was preparing for when I originally built my deck.
And I think what you're saying there kind of dovetails with what I was saying. I'm trying to make you look at your whole pool as what you're going to build your deck out of. And you're trying to say you also don't have to care about anything but the cards you've seen and what's in your opponent's deck. So
and what you can predict from that, etc.
Right. If you see 5 black-white life gain cards, you don't have to guess about your opponent having more. They probably will have more. That just makes sense. So let's talk about some of the things you can do while you're sideboarding because, part of the problem I think a lot of people have as well is that they think sideboarding means bringing in stuff like, Surge of Righteousness that kills a red or a black creature, or bringing in a Plummet, or bringing in a Disenchant or a Naturalize. And sideboarding is a lot more than that. So just a couple examples of things that you can do. Even in draft, you can switch colors. You can take out all kinds of a specific class of creature. You can take out premium removal. You can bring in bad creatures. I mean, these are all things that I've done. And these are all things that I think you would do if you're using your sideboard to its full effect.
Yeah, why don't we talk about some of the situations where that comes up?
So the first thing is pay a really close attention to what your opponent is doing. I mean, you talked about seeing your opponent's pool, and that means that you have to be kind of utilizing that information. You have to be either writing that information down or memorizing it. I don't write it down because that kind of disrupts my flow, but I know a lot of people who do. And writing down every card your opponent plays is just a perfectly good reference to look at when you're sideboarding. What you want to pay attention to is specifically stuff like conditional removal cards like Smite the Monstrous or cards that deal 1 damage, specific threats that you have to deal with, like your opponent has, Guardian of Tazim, like we just talked about. That card's very, very hard to beat if you don't get it off the board, and something like a Tightening Coils doesn't answer it. So you need to pay attention to those kind of cards. What your opponent's overall game plan is a big one. And then categories like counterspells, combat tricks, sweepers. And this doesn't even have to do with sideboarding. You just need to know these things about your opponent's deck so you can play against their deck, but it also is critical to know about during sideboarding.
Yeah, and you're going to get double value out of it. I like where you're going with that. It takes what I said to the next step, which is that not only do you have a subset of cards that you need to beat, but you also have to understand what those cards are doing together for your opponent, how they're going to act, how they're going to interact together, how to combat that, and also what their overall game plan is. Is their deck fast? Are they trying to run you over? Is their deck slow, trying to get to the late game? Do they have great answers where, if you're trying to rely on one big win condition to get you there, are they going to have a few ways to get at it? These are all things that you're going to want to be asking yourself and comparing to your strategy.
Right. And you can predict things like, the example of black-white life gain, or if you see a bunch of flyers, you can predict your opponent's probably focusing on flyers. And even if you only saw 3 in game 1, they probably have like 10 or 9 because those decks tend to do that. And yes, you could be wrong, and maybe you can readjust if you go to a game 3, but you can make some of these predictions. And, I think that figuring out what your opponent's playing and what the common interactions are is such a big part of Magic that a lot of people, I don't think they spend enough time on, because looking ahead to the next game and trying to figure out how your actions should change in those games is it's just a huge way to get an edge. It's more than just I'm going to play the board. Like, yeah, in game one, when your opponent plays like, a 3/3, sometimes you're going to be like, well, I'm going to kill that card because I have a removal spell. Post-board games, you should be either way more hesitant because you know that they have a 3/3 flyer that you just have to kill, or you should be way more aggressive. Like, I'm going to go ahead and use complete disregard on their 2/1 because I know they're just like a super fast beatdown deck, and every point of damage matters. So
that's a great point.
How you should be playing, it's more even than just the cards. How you should be playing is just different in post-board games. So your sideboard is also your game plan. It's not, even if you switch 0 cards, games tend to be different post-board. I mean, this favors the more practiced player. That basically, the more information you give, I think in general that tends to favor people who know what's going on with the format more, or who have played a lot more. That's not universal, but it is. I think that's the tendency.
God, I love that. Yeah, I had never considered it quite that way. The idea of not only sideboarding in different cards for a given matchup, but actually sideboarding in a different strategy, right? It's not just the cards. You could even keep all the cards the same, but just the way that you're going to approach the game. I think a lot of us do that sort of intuitively, but I like the idea of classifying it that way and saying, no, I'm consciously going to do this. And that leads me to a question, Luis. Do you think about that stuff while you're like let's say game one ends? Are you thinking to yourself, what is my opponent trying to do? Big picture here. Like, are they a fast deck, a slow deck? Like, are these the kind of things that are going through your head?
Certainly. And a lot of decks kind of fall into the middle because that's just how limited works. But when you play against a particularly fast deck, you start to think like, all right, how am I going to survive? Or I should deprioritize what I use removal on. Because again, in game one, if your opponent played, like a Coral Helm Guide, a 2/1 with a minor ability, you're not going to cast a decent removal spell on it just because you're not going to get into approach it all that often because you'd rather kill like a 3/3 flyer. But if your opponent's playing red-blue aggro and has a bunch of counter spells and just wants to deal 10 with its first creatures and then sneak in more damage, all of a sudden you're just firing off your removal spell at their 2/1. And the inverse, is also true where sometimes you can't get into approach their 3/2 flyer, even though that's a very natural play, because you know that they have 2 4/4 flyers and you have no way to kill them.
Right, and they'll just tear you up.
So that sort of thing is something I think about going into the game. Also, so you don't think about it in the game. This especially comes into play in counterspells because when your opponent plays a creature and you think about it before not countering it, that's a huge tell. And yes, sometimes people do it on purpose, but in general, you give your opponent information when you do that. You should know whether you not want to counter most spells before they play them. What I mean is when you leave up a counterspell and then they play like a kind of bad creature, you should have already known that you didn't want to counter that. And this happens a lot more in constructed, not to dip too much into the forbidden territory of 60 card decks, but you should have a good idea of which spells you want to use counters on or which not to, so you don't sit there thinking with spells on the stack and let your opponent know, oh, I've got to worry about a counter spell.
Yeah, that's really good. Another kind of big picture point, going to what you were just talking about a few minutes ago about figuring out what your opponent's doing is, it kind of timed out reasonably here, but like last week we talked about the different archetypes in Battle for Zendikar. That's information you can use not just to know how to draft a good deck yourself, but to already have an idea of what your opponent's doing, even if you haven't drafted it yourself, right? If you see your opponent playing the Black-White Life Gain deck and you haven't gotten around to it yourself and you've listened to the show, you're going to have an idea what the key cards are and how it actually wins. And that's going to give you a big edge because it's going to let you know how to attack that and what are the important things that you need to deal with. So keep that in mind as well, as you learn and talk to your friends and listen to the podcast and read articles or whatever, that information's not just meant to be for you. It's meant to be applied to what your opponent's doing as well.
And, that shortcuts, this borrows from a point that I was going to make later, which is I think that the people who are most successful in limited formats, especially in sealed, because a lot of people have this theory that, sealed's all luck. And that's why when Turtnall went 9-0, 5 sealed GPs in a row.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is a lot of practicing sealed especially is knowing common interactions between cards and how certain decks do against other decks and being able to sideboard to take advantage of it. It comes up less in draft because you drafted the Blue-White Flyers deck. You can't side into Black-White Life Gain. You just don't have the card pool for that. In sealed, you frequently will be able to make those kind of swaps, and knowing which decks have good matchups and which specific cards have good matchups is super important, and you can't learn it instantly. It's going to be really hard to learn it without actually playing. and you have to know it fast enough to actually take advantage of it in sideboard. So that's where I think jamming practice games is super, super important, and why a lot of the same people tend to do well, because they know these things, and even if they haven't actually like written or said these things out loud, they know them, and their decisions are impacted by them. So
Okay.
let's go to a little more specific cases here and start at level 1. Level 1, specific removal spells. Cards like Plummet, like Naturalize. These are cards that they say on them what you should be sideboarding them in against. And that's certainly part of
this is the color specific ones as well.
Yeah, this is cards that say like kill a red or black creature, kill a flying creature, kill an artifact. These are straight up sideboard cards. We talk about them as sideboard cards. I think people are pretty good at bringing those in. So it's, the high power ones you want to take, like Rending Volley, just a 4-mana go that deals 4 damage to a blue or white creature for 1 red mana is uncounterable. That card's obviously very, very good if you bring it in. So people tend to take it kind of high. And when you have these cards, you're going to bring them in when appropriate. I think most people are able to get there, and that's cool, because I think it's good to have it's good to have some low-hanging fruit, just because that does get you more into that mindset. But I think most people kind of understand this.
Yeah.
Other cards in this category are slightly one level removed. This is things like counter spells against expensive cards. Again, that's not groundbreaking. When you have, Spell Shrivel in Battle for Zendikar, which is counter a spell unless they pay 4, that card's pretty effective if your opponent's trying to resolve a 7 or 8 drop, if that's just their goal. And you're going to be more likely to bring it in. If your opponent has, an Emeria Shepherd, then I'm highly likely to bring in Spell Shrivel, because the card's already almost good enough by itself, if not good enough. And once they know they have some really juicy targets for them, it gets a lot better.
It gets a lot better. Yeah. It also gives you a better chance to draw it. Yeah. It just gets way better.
Another very frequently used category for me is siding in 1/1s against 2/1s. Mm-hmm. Because we always rail about how 1/1s, especially like 1/1 flyers, are not playable, and then I draft multiple of them on stream and have them in my deck. But we rail against these 1/1s, but if your opponent's got a lot of 2/1s, 1/1s are fine. They trade for 2/1s. You spent less mana. I will snap bring in Kitesail Scout if I see multiple 2/1 flyers out of my opponent. It's just a good card to have. You're paying 1 white mana to essentially deal 1 to a flying creature, and they have a bunch of 2/1 flyers.
Yeah, and we've talked on the show about defensive speed before, about the idea of making sure that you have good plays to make in the early game against the faster decks, the decks that are faster than yours. And that's a great example of a way that you can introduce some defensive speed. It's a conditional scenario, but when it pops up, it's going to work out pretty well for you.
Yeah, the 2 most common scenarios where I bring in Kitesail Scout or have it in my deck is when your opponent's got a lot of 2/1s or 2/1 flyers in particular, or when you're disconnected in a draft and you miss a bunch of picks. So, another category of cards that's similar to counterspells are Mind Rots. These are your 3 to 4 mana, your opponent discards 2 cards, because discard is good against expensive spells.
Yeah.
Against a deck with all cheap spells, they'll discard extra lands and no big deal. If you Mind Rot someone and their hand is 2 lands and a 7-drop and they have like 5 lands in play, it's not a good situation for them.
Right. So, you're happy either way.
And then cards like Slow Card Advantage. Going back a couple formats, one that I really loved was the Blessing of Thasar, or whatever it is called, the 5 in a blue, draw 3 cards, mill your opponent for 3.
Oh, yeah. I remember that.
That card is highly unplayable, but against a really slow deck, paying 6 mana to draw 3 cards is a fine deal. So these are your more specific cards, and these are the cards that once you learn like the conditions for bringing them in, you're going to do a pretty good job of bringing them in. We've tried to give you these examples here. And in draft, you do have to keep in mind that these cards have additional value more than just what they look like Kitesail Scout looking bad, or Mind Rots in general looking kind of medium. So I think in Battle for Zendikar, I do like to pick up these kind of cards when there's no good main deck picks for me.
Yeah, and I wanted to mention something about that too, Luis, about when to pick these and how that part works. We've taken the stance on the show for a long time now that hate drafting, taking cards that are meant to go to your opponents, is generally not good. That's generally not the strategy that will get you the most wins. And this episode actually kind of hits on part of the reason why that's the case. Drafting those narrow, effective sideboard cards that Luis referenced just a little while ago is really good. I mean, those type of cards, when you do bring them in, tend to be some of the better cards in your deck, right? All of a sudden, if Plummet is routinely killing a 3 to 5 mana flyer, and you can expect it to consistently do that in a game, all of a sudden you've got the best removal spell in your whole deck. that you're bringing in out of the sideboard. And so picking up those type of cards instead of hate drafting is kind of a no-brainer. That just makes sense. You make your deck a lot better in certain matchups. But it goes even deeper than that.
Can I say one thing?
Yeah.
Can people just not hate draft? Can they just stop doing that?
Yeah, just don't do that.
just don't hate draft. First of all, your win percentage will probably go up because it's just almost never correct. And then second of all, we all get to draft our sweet decks.
Yes. This is a call for peace from Luis Scott-Vargas.
Well, I'm still going to hate draft because I know how to.
Oh, come on now. Do as I say.
I actually just don't hate draft.
Yeah, I almost never do. I mean, if there's just stone nothing, I won't. But here's the thing. Most people's bar is too high for that. And you can lower it down. And where I was going with this is, yes, so you get these narrow, really effective sideboard cards. And it does make sense to take those over hate drafting. But it actually goes even deeper than that. And sometimes you'll pass something like, let's say a 2-3 for 3. That could go in your deck, but probably won't. And there's a decent card that you're kind of scared of, so you'll take it from your opponent instead. And maybe there's a big 8-drop that you don't really plan on playing in your deck because you look at it and you're trying to be a little more of a curve-out deck, and so you're just not in the market for an 8-mana spell, so you take something away from somebody else and let that one go. And these type of things actually can come back to bite you. A lot of times you look at these matchups and they end up being big picture specific. Things like, is my opponent playing a really slow control deck, a really grindy deck, where you might want a card like Dutiful Return, for example, that you probably wouldn't prioritize ever. Others things like the big 8-drop that I talked about, maybe you want that. Is your opponent playing a hyper fast, really quick deck? That 2-3 for 3 that you probably wasn't going to make the main deck, that might do really well replacing, say, a slow, not board affecting card that you just don't want in your deck anymore, or a 7-drop that isn't really a game winner and you just need to get it out of your decks and make sure that you're affecting the board early. You pick up these cards, even if you know you're not going to put them in the main deck, and you're just adding to your profile of flexibility. You can now change around your deck and make it slower, faster, leaner, meaner, whatever it is that you need. And while there's subtle changes, whenever you bring in a card out of the sideboard, it's not just how good that card is, it's how much good that card is over how bad the card that it's replacing was. And I'll tell you what, if you've got a 7 or 8 mana creature that you're running in your deck because you just needed a finisher or whatever, and your opponent's playing a really fast, really good curve out type deck, and you can take that card out and just put like a 2-3 for 3 into your deck, you're going to be really happy. And the difference between how bad that 8-drop is against this opponent and how reasonable a 2-3 for 3 is big. And that doesn't seem like much because we're not talking about bringing in Plummet against the Flyers deck where it just is obviously very good. We're talking about a much more subtle change. But if you start hate drafting and giving up on those and not taking the 8-drop for yourself when you need it against a really slow opponent or opponent that you find you're just going to have a stall out and you need something to go over the top, you're just giving up value. So when you're actually in the draft portion, this obviously doesn't apply to sealed because you just get what you get. But in the draft, it does matter. And this is just another reason why hate drafting isn't great, but it's also something to keep in mind that even if you're going to pass a card that doesn't necessarily make the main deck, that doesn't mean that you won't want that type of effect sometimes to sub in for something that's a lot worse against certain types of opponents. So keep that in mind while you're going through the draft.
Definitely. And keep in mind that, we're going to try to get into as many examples as we can, but a lot of cards are sideboard cards that don't look like sideboard cards.
Right.
And wanting to have one of these and not having it is way worse than, again, getting hate drafting or something along those lines, or even drafting sideboard cards over cards for your deck. So
right.
Trying to balance that is important too. Cause for sure we would take, cause the cycle of color hosers in dragons, like Rending Volley or Surge of Righteousness, these are just very strong cards. These are cards that we would frequently take over main deckable cards because, your last 4 main deck cards are way worse than these sideboard cards when you bring them in.
Right. Exactly. That difference is huge.
So the next step here is figuring out how to blank your opponent's removal. And this is not something you can always do, but when you can do it, the reward is substantial. So some of the things to look for: does your opponent have a lot of deal 1 effects? Because deal 1 effects, frequently you're going to have a deck with 2 to 3 1 toughness creatures, and you can just take those all out. Your goal is to make it so their deal 1s are never a full card. And if that means siding out a good 1 toughness creature, sometimes that is just correct to do. I've taken out, like, you have a Nettle Drone. It's, it's your red-white aggro, you have a Nettle Drone, but all your other creatures are like X2s, and Nettle Drone's just a fine card in your deck. It's a good card. It's a card you'd always want to play, but your opponent has multiple ways to deal 1 damage. All of a sudden, Nettle Drone is just not a good card. It's just a liability. You should just take it out. And even replace it with something like, one of the 2/3 McKindy guys that gives vigilance. Like that's the sort of thing that when your opponent has a deal 1 and you have a 2/3 instead of a 3/1, you've won that battle. And you're going to force your opponent to like trade a 2/2 plus the deal 1 for your 2/3, and that's great for you.
Right.
Another big one that comes up a lot in this format is Smite the Monstrous, the kill a creature with 4 more strength. This is a card that you can easily play around in some decks. In some decks you can't. I'm not saying that if you have 7 creatures that are big enough to get smited, that you should take them all out, because frequently it's just not going to be possible. But against, if you're going back to this red-white beatdown deck, you've got 2 creatures with 4 more power. You've got, you've got a bunch of 2/2s and 3/2s apparently. If you've seen an opponent cast Smite the Monstrous, look at your sideboard. See if you can downgrade a 4/4, like a 4/4 for 5 into a 3/3 for 4. That. If you can strand a dead card in your opponent's hand, it's worth so much. It's worth way more than the drop-off you get from turning a 4/4 into a 3/3. And clearly when you turn a 4/4 into a 3/3, you're probably getting a little bit of mana back too. You're not just straight up giving one of your creatures -1/-1.
Right. And that comes up in a very profound way. I mean, anybody that listens to the show knows how, me and you, we're really down on cards that just don't do anything in some circumstances. That's a major hit, and often one that I'm not willing to take on unless the payoff is really, really high. And if you can force your opponent into that scenario, I mean, that's huge. Oh man, the game that you win with them just staring down at the removal spell that you maneuvered around is so awesome. Like, it feels really good.
It does, and the priority to do this for me goes up so much when I see multiples. And again, going back to Smite, because this is a card, the deal ones we're talking about, those are never going to be completely dead because you can generally use them for something. Smite the Monstrous is just straight up dead. If I see my opponent cast 2 Smite the Monstrous in game 1, which is, it's a very reasonable card to play 2 of, it's a good card in this format. If I see 2 of them in game 1, I'm really going into the tank to see if I can figure out how to make it so that those cards do nothing. If I can make my opponent mulligan once or twice, like, that's huge. So I'm willing to put in 2 mana 2/2s over 4/4 flyers. If I'm running something like 4 smite targets and they have 2 smites, it's actually a disaster for me, because they're just likely to have a smite when you've got a smite target, and they traded 4 mana for your 6 mana or 7 mana.
I love that. I love the idea of taking those type of cards out too, because what it can do is it can turn a scenario that could be frustrating into something that's actually very productive. And, I'm a big fan of doing that whenever you can. But, if I threw a scenario at you, Luis, where you had 2 smite targets in your deck and your opponent smited both of them in game 1, you may be tempted to feel bad and say, my opponent got so lucky. Like, they had 2 smites and they found both targets. This is just unreal, right? Like, I only had 2 things they could kill in the whole
It's unreal.
deck.
You're heinously lucky.
You're heinously unlucky.
I agree. That's a good point.
Right.
So anyway,
and you fall for that temptation, right? Of just feeling bad for yourself or something, but you can so use that against them. And because here's the thing, they don't know that. They don't know that they got lucky and that they hit your only thing unless you tell them, unless you say, that was my only other smite target. You are so lucky, right? And people do that. They spew off that kind of value. And if you just play it sly and don't say a damn thing and be like, yep, you got it. And then when you go to sideboarding, just sort of get those 2 targets out of there and let them know that they feel great about their 2 smites. And, they killed 2, 2 angels or whatever it was that you played. And now they have no targets. They are not going to take those smites out. They're going to be quite happy with them. And they're going to pat themselves on the back for building such a well-rounded, awesome deck. And you are going to trash them in the next couple of games. And the key there is that you didn't tilt off and you didn't fall for the trap of, complaining to your opponent about your bad luck or whatever it was. Instead, you twisted it around and used it against them. And this is just one of the ways you can do that.
Definitely. And think about it from your opponent's point of view as well. If they nail 2 creatures with smite in game 1, they're probably not taking those smites out.
No, they're so happy about it.
So think about it. What I have done though is sometimes, you make the sideboard swap and then your opponent, plays game 2, and you don't know if they've drawn Smite because they never cast it, but they've got cards in their hand. They never played this game. You think maybe they drew a Smite. You could think about putting the cards back in. I generally wouldn't. People don't take out good removal spells. You should. You're listening to this. We're going to tell you exactly when you should, but people in general do not take out premium removal. So, and Smite is pretty close to that. So,
yeah.
If they already had, basically, if they've seen a hit in game 1, then they didn't hit in game 2, they're probably still going to have it in their deck in game 3. They might hedge and take one out, but in general, if this is a good plan, it's a good plan. So, blanking your opponent's removal is something that works really well. And this also doesn't mean just removal. It also means creature interactions. So, going back to the example of, the 2/1s versus the 1/1s, if you're on the wrong side of that, if you've got a bunch of 2/1s and they have a bunch of 2/3s, and maybe you're not a super aggressive deck, you're a mid-range deck, and you have a couple decent like 2/2s or 2/1s, and your opponent just plays 4 creatures, that are 2/3s or 3/3s on the ground, you should just think about taking out those 2/2s or 2/1s and just putting in maybe some inefficient 3/3s or 4/3s or 5/5s or something that would be worse in a vacuum, but once you've seen these cards is no longer worse. And you can get an advantage there because, again, the way creatures line up is just very equivalent to how removal lines up. And you want to figure out the best way to make it so your creatures line up in the most advantageous way against theirs. And one way to do that is, again, we're talking about a lot of downgrades in the strict sense because that's why you played some cards in your main deck and others in your sideboard. But when your opponent's card pool, when you know the cards you've seen, then you have just so much more information. So you're able to make these downgrades because they're not really downgrades.
Right. All right. So, what do we got next?
Another one. This is a big one. This is when it's time to shift your game plan, and this works a lot better in sealed. And again, we're going to get to some more sealed specific stuff later, but this works for both draft and sealed. It's just way more common in sealed. And this is when you've got a deck that does a thing, and you figure out that the thing you're doing is not very good against what the thing your opponent's doing, and it's time to find a new thing. So one example is you've got a decent ramp deck. You've ramped to a few big threats. But your opponent just has good counterspells and good answers. They just have a control deck that has the perfect answers for your threats. You're not one of those super great ramp decks that ramps into Ulamog. That card's super hard to deal with. You're a ramp deck that, ramps into like maybe an Amaria Shepherd and another, like a Breaker of Armies, something like that. And you just play against an opponent that just has like 3 counterspells and a couple unconditional removal spells. And all of a sudden you're just thinking like, and they have some card draw, for example. They just like a good control deck. You're like, well, this ramp deck is not really going to work here. So trying to shift your game plan, and depending on the deck you have, this can be more or less drastic. One I actually like, to look at some of the other formats I've been playing recently is siding in some like mill cards, for example. This is something like in Origins, siding in Sphinx's Tutelage was a very effective plan because that wasn't a card you'd always main deck. But if you're playing a control matchup, and you side that in, the card is excellent.
Yeah, when they just couldn't put any pressure on you directly, you could really get a lot of value out of that.
And one that I actually just did was siding in Curse of the Bloody Tome in Innistrad. And since we're returning to Innistrad, who knows, maybe we'll see this card there. This is a 2 and a blue enchantment. Your opponent just gets milled for 2 a turn. It's just like a bad Sphinx's Tutelage. But I sided it in because my opponent had tons of removal and I had not very many threats. All of a sudden, I just milled them out because they had a ton of removal and I wasn't really trying to kill them.
Yeah, that's great.
And you might not have something that extreme, but even something like deciding, all right, I need a different suite of threats. I'm going to play a couple different threats because of what I've seen out of my opponent. Or I'm going to try to, I've got some kind of mediocre flyers, but I'm just going to try to board in a couple mediocre flyers and be more of a mid-range deck than a deck that's ramping to these 1 or 2 cards. So this is a way to make a ramp deck into something else, though more often it'll happen when you're playing aggro. And the example here is you're playing an aggro deck, and then you just run into the maniac with 3 fortified barriers and a bunch of McKinley patrols, and it's just like, wow, my small creatures are just terrible. What you might be able to do is take out a couple of your small creatures and add in a couple inefficient 7 or 8 drops. This is the sort of thing where Eldrazi Devastator comes into play.
Yep. Because
if they've seen you play an aggro deck, they're probably going to have all their anti-aggro stuff in, and they might be very vulnerable to the Eldrazi Devastator or to cards like Mire's Malice, the discard too. Going a little bigger. One of the common tropes in Magic is you just want to be a little bigger than your opponent. Like the control decks are a little bigger than the mid-range decks, so they beat the mid-range decks, whereas the mid-range decks are just a little bit bigger than the aggro decks, so they beat the aggro decks. You don't want to be too much bigger because sometimes you'll have a mismatch where you have 8 drops and they have 1 drops, but the 6-drop deck beats the 5-drop deck, and the 5-drop deck beats the 4-drop deck. So if your opponent is expecting you to beat the 1 to 2 drop deck, and they're at a 3 and 4 drop deck, sliding in some 5s and 6s can actually be very effective.
Yeah, and these are some pretty high level sideboarding concepts, but they are effective. You do have to have a good read, and the more you know about what your opponent's doing, the better they get. We talked earlier about, from game 1 to game 2, and then if there's a game 3, how much knowledge you can have about your opponent's deck, specifically about the cards. You're also extrapolating that out and figuring out what their strategy is going to be and what kind of cards you can expect from them. But yeah, the more you know about what your opponent's doing specifically, the more you can employ these type of more drastic, like bringing in different, bigger cards, smaller cards, whatever, to try to combat what they're doing.
And bear in mind that this won't always happen in game 2. Sometimes it won't happen until game 3, because sometimes you'll just play a game 1 where you don't see very many of your opponent's cards, and you use the example, you'll see 5 or 6 of your opponent's cards. Sure, that may be close to a third, but you don't have enough information to know that your plan isn't going to work. Maybe you even win game 1, and then after game 2, you're like, well, actually now I've seen 80% of my opponent's cards, and now I actually have the information I need to make these swaps.
Yeah. I think that, one way to look at it too is, there's no shame in not bringing in cards out of the board, but there's a lot of shame in not thinking about it.
Yeah.
If you come to the conclusion that, look, I just haven't seen enough to know, I still think that this build is optimal and I just don't have enough information at this point, I'm just going to run it back. That happens pretty often. But if you just click submit or just, start shuffling for the next game immediately without giving any thought, you're leaving value on the table.
So one of the things that I do is I think of a lot about how I'm going to sideboard during game 1 while I'm playing. And if I've come to the conclusion I'm not sideboarding anything and my opponent doesn't reach for their sideboard, I will not reach for my sideboard because I don't want to remind them to look through their sideboard.
Yeah. How many times have you done that? It happens all the time.
Literally hundreds.
Yeah. And where yeah, exactly. I've had that happen so many times where I'll start shuffling. Maybe I'm thinking in my head, like, okay, what do I need to bring in here? And then I'll go reach for my deck box and then boom, they go reach for their, oh yeah, sideboarding. I'm like, oh no, I didn't think you were going to, but a little friendly reminder there gets them pretty often.
And sometimes, that probably has cost me because I would have maybe sideboarded something, but most of the time I try to have a very good idea of my good sideboard options. And if I decide I'm not going to do that, and my opponent doesn't look like they're looking, I'm going to assume it's more likely that I don't want to sideboard anything that I should not let them get an opportunity to do so.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just a funny little thing.
It is funny. Yeah. I mean, most people, they sideboard at very much level 1, which is, these are my sideboard cards. I have 2 of them. One of them kills a red creature. The other one kills an artifact. If I see red creatures or artifacts that I want to kill, I will probably bring them in. If I don't, then I won't. And that's kind of the end of the story for them. And, to be honest, that's not an unreasonable approach. That is where you get the most value. That's where you take out your worst card and get one of your top 3 cards in your deck in exchange for it. So the swing is absolutely huge when you do that and when you draw those cards. But taking this holistic approach certainly affects your win percentage in a meaningful way. And looking a little deeper is definitely the way to go. Though most people don't. You'll see it. Most people just don't do it.
And hitting really quickly on a note about shifting your game plan is cards that can win the game by themselves in a very obtuse way, like Tutelage or Curse of the Bloody Tome. These are the kind of cards, there's not very many per format, but these are the kind of cards that I will look at and look to have in my sideboard, even if you're not going to run them in the main deck. Even something very strange, like milling cards are very frequently this, because they tend not to be a very good rate, so you don't want them in your deck, but they also can win a game in a very unexpected angle. Cards like Retreat to Hagra that drain your opponent, are the sort of thing. What you're trying to look for is a card that's hard to deal with under normal circumstances that can kill your opponent by itself. And these are the kind of cards that really shine in some specific matchups.
And they are often enchantments.
Yes, because a lot of colors and decks will just not have any ways to kill enchantments. Right. So another thing to think about when you're looking at your sideboard is siding in another color. And, like you said, a lot of people have their list of 2 or 3 sideboard cards, and these are the cards they bring in. Sometimes during the draft, you want to take cards of a different color because they're also good sideboard cards. And actually, in my first draft at PT Origins, I sided in 2 aerial volleys in a forest in 2 of my 3 matches. I was playing red-white, but I had an Evolving Wilds as well. Mm-hmm. And because I just played against 2 Thopter flyer decks that aerial volley was great against, and I was, particularly weak against. So don't be afraid to side another color if it gets you the thing you need. Like, if you're playing against a deck that has an enchantment, like Citadel Siege was a great example from Favorite Forged.
Mm-hmm.
That card is unbeatable. If your opponent play it, you're going to lose the game. If you have no way to kill it, that's the kind of card I would side in another color for a disenchant, because you have to be able to kill it. You're just going to lose if they have it otherwise. I mean, I'm not saying I will 100% do that, but I'm saying you will definitely consider it. And sometimes if you're playing red-black, you just have to go to another color for that sort of effect. So sometimes the card you're going to get is worth so much that you're willing to change the color configuration in your draft deck, even though you would think that would never happen.
Right.
So the next kind of thing I want to tackle is sideboarding and sealed, because sideboarding and sealed is actually much harder, more intricate, and more rewarding than in draft. All the things we talked about you can use in draft, and I think you'll get a lot of value out of them. There are a lot of good upgrades you can make and good ways to think about things. I think trying to think about how cards match up is just a really important concept even when you're not sideboarding. But sealed is where you can really go deep. And first of all, sealed, you have a lot more cards. You just have this gigantic card pool. 90 cards in if you have 15 card packs, or 84 cards in a 14 card pack, and that's a lot of cards. And what that means is, first of all, the deck you have is not necessarily going to bear any relation to the deck you end up in after board.
Right.
Second of all, you have a ton of options for individual upgrades, even within your color, because you just kind of have a lot of cards of your colors that you don't end up playing. And you have a lot of specific answers and specific threats that you can put in the situations we described earlier. So my game plan going into any sealed, this does dovetail for next week, but this is general. This goes for any format. Is first of all, figure out the deck you want to play, but in that process, you probably are going to decide between a couple different decks. I mean, yes, sometimes you open a sealed deck that's like, well, I've got 3 red rares and 2 blue rares and a bunch of good blue and red cards. I'm playing blue-red.
Right.
I mean, that's great. Sometimes that's going to happen. Mostly it's going to be like, should I play black-white or should I play green-white? Because I'm definitely going to play white. White is my best color, but there's 2 viable ways, or maybe even 3 viable ways to pair it. Or should I play this blue-white control deck, or should I play this black-red aggro deck? They both have some pretty good strengths. They don't overlap, so it's just like one or the other.
Right.
And whenever you end up in one of those situations, you've got multiple decks. Some of those decks you're going to want to play in other spots, because when you have multiple decks that are good or of the same power level, sometimes that's bad because you got unlucky. But if you have multiple decks of roughly the same power level or level of appeal to you, then it's going to be frequent that some of the decks your opponents are playing match up better against some and worse against others. Sometimes you're playing that blue-white deck, but you play against someone who's got better flyers or just a better blue-white deck than you, but you've got a good red-black aggro deck that actually might be fast enough, so you're going to switch, or vice versa. So having those decks built and prepared and actually practiced with, if you can, is very important. One of the things I do during sealed tournaments is I'll try to play games with my sealed decks in between rounds or before rounds or what have you. And yeah, I do think that people tend to undervalue like the the benefit they get from resting between rounds and not thinking about too much stuff. But in sealed, there's such a payoff that I tend to at least the first couple of rounds practice, and then afterwards I'm usually pretty good to go. But trying to practice with these decks is really important, and having them built, having them all sleeved, knowing what your swaps are going to be. These are important even if you're not making specific deck by deck adjustments. This is just like, I've got this red-black deck built and I've got this blue-white deck built and I know how to switch between them. Or I know how to switch my blue-white deck into a white-green deck. And that's just a key part of sealed that is technically sideboarding, but that's even not worrying over much about like what you're playing against. You just need to know, you need to know how to do this because, some rounds you're going to want to.
Yeah. And it is interesting too, especially when, if you do end up with one of those pools that has 2 viable builds, maybe with a color crossover, sometimes not, right? Sometimes it's just you've got 2 completely separate decks that don't actually share a color at all, and they're both reasonable, maybe not great, but reasonable. I mean, you need to be able to leverage that flexibility. If both of the decks are just okay, you have to be thinking about which one is going to be good in the given matchup that you're facing down, because that's how you can make up the edge and get yourself into the top 8 of a, PPTQ or whatever, or regional PTQ or something, rather than just sticking with what, you feel is marginally better than the other and just never letting go. Another thing that pops up sometimes is that I've seen people switch for the sake of switching. Basically, they let off with one deck every single time, let their opponent try to adjust, and then threw a completely different deck at them. A slower deck and then a faster deck, or a fast deck and then a slow deck, can often be really complementary to each other. as, your opponent is going to be, hopefully employing some sideboard strategy or whatever. And just by simply keeping them off balance, you can get some advantage. What you'll probably want to do is have a reasonable idea of what your opponent's doing. Try to guess, after game one, like Louis said before, even if you know 5 or 6 cards, that's a nice start, but you need some experience in the format to know what the kind of things that deck is capable of doing and what kind of game plan it's trying to employ. And then you can make a decision based on, which of the 2 decks you have in your pile that you want to do. Another one that pops up pretty often is to splash or not to splash, right? And this happens in sealed all the time because it's tempting to have the excuse of, well, it's slower. I can splash. It'll be fine. And sometimes that is true and sometimes it's not. But one thing that I've definitely noticed is that I've been on the fence about whether I should splash, and it was probably justifiable, but it cost me. And so sometimes I'll take the more conservative route, and the deck that I actually submit is a 2-color deck without a splash. And if I see that my opponent isn't going to apply a lot of pressure to me or doesn't have the certain type of game plan that punishes what I'm doing, and I'm going to have actually more time to find my splashes, and it really does up the power level of my deck, I'll bring in that splash post board. And that's another question that you can ask yourself while doing the deck build and while doing it. I mean, the way I actually view sealed is it's a lot more fluid, I think, than people give it credit for. I kind of view the deck that I submit as my first draft, or maybe my initial offering, the version 1.0, but by no means do I consider that to be the deck that I'm running all day. I might have another deck build. I might have a different build of the same deck that's a little faster, a little slower, a little better against certain things. I may have that splash lined up, and all of these are tools that I'm looking to employ. The key is that I have to always be thinking, and I'll admit, I get lazy or forgetful about this sometimes too, but I have to really ask myself, what is my opponent doing? What is their game plan? What do I know about the color pair that they're doing? What can I expect from it in the next game? What kind of removal spells does that color pair have? Does it match well against what I'm doing now? Is there any changes I can make to do it? And, consciously actually thinking about those things can be difficult to do in the moment because you get kind of caught up in the emotions and the strategy of a game of Magic. But if you can take a breath, look around the room, look up at the ceiling for a minute and say, okay, honestly, if I had to make my best guess at what my opponent's doing, what would it be? And, you're going to have an idea for what kind of speed of deck they have. What kind of strategy? Is it the kind of strategy that tries to make the game go long? Is it one that can kill you without attacking you? Is it all nettle drones just sort of pecking away at you where you're going to want to be pressuring them with creatures and forcing them to trade off with those nettle drones? Is it a slow deck that's going to try to put up a couple of really big threats and take over the late game while controlling the board? Is there a way you can combat that? There probably is. You get a lot of cards in a sealed pool. So be thinking about that and really trying to make educated guesses as to what your opponent's doing. Even if you haven't seen, their whole deck or even the majority of it, you can often take a pretty reasonable stab at what they're up to.
That's actually a really cool idea. I'd never thought about, you've got 2 decks that are 7 out of 10, one's aggro, one's control, and just running the auto swap just to try to catch your opponent in sideboarding.
Yeah, I've seen some people do that at PTQs around here.
So it's the sort of thing that I feel like most of the time you don't want to do because realistically one's a 7.3 and one's a 7.1 and you should just play the 7.3. But when 2 decks are that comparable, it does seem like a good little upgrade. I mean, you might as well get value, right?
Especially if your opponent, if you see them immediately dive into their sideboard and start ripping cards out, you can really throw them for a loop.
This does bring to mind how valuable it is to have sleight of hand. I've seen people take out their deck, de-sleeve a bunch of cards, sleeve a bunch of cards, and you just know they're sideboarding a ton of stuff. Whereas if you have 2 decks sleeved, you open your deck box and you just do a little swap, a full swap. It doesn't take very long. I could see people just be completely shocked that their opponent switched entire decks because they have no idea. So
yeah, it is funny. In Constructed, you'll often see the players board in all of their sideboard cards because there's only 15, shuffle up their deck and then go pull 15 cards out, leaving them with just the 60 left over. But in Limited, that's a little bit ambitious.
Right. People don't do exactly that.
No, I do remember a tweet from John Laux a really long time ago where he jokingly said that I always shuffle in my whole sideboard, ... even in sealed. It's just like he's dedicated. And of course he was
like a
joking.
way to end with a 42 card deck that's incorrect.
Well, I don't think that's fairly typical for John anyway. But yeah, you do have to, kind of make sure. And, I think it's fair to gauge the skill level of your opponent, how much they're paying attention. And, I've seen people do this a lot. And I tend to not think that it's a big deal, but I have seen people do kind of what you said, where they'll bring in some amount of cards and just pull them back out again. Just to not let your opponent know that you're either doing something or not doing something. I think the idea with that is gauge it to, if somebody's paying attention, it might be worth it to do that. Don't make a production out of it, right? You're not in Hollywood. You don't need to put your hand on your chin and, and you can just sort of swap a couple of cards in and out.
What's that over there?
Yeah, exactly. And you can just, it's more, I think that if most players could not shuffle in their entire 15 card sideboard and constructed, they would just not, but they just feel like I have to do this, to make sure that my opponent doesn't get an undue advantage. And, occasionally faking a swap for a card in sealed is fine too. Just, keep the time limit reasonable, and you don't have to make a big deal out of it.
This is a slight off topic, but the more I've noticed, the people who think the most about these Bush League tricks, like, the pen trick or figuring out these swaps, or, trying to get soul reads on their opponent, the more people who think about these the most tend to not do as well as if they just concentrated on playing better. So
yes, agreed. And we could do a whole show on that, I'm sure.
No, we just said it though.
Yeah, we don't have to.
So all the things we said earlier, all the different sideboard plans we said earlier, or interactions, go basically 200% in sealed, because you have twice as many cards. You just have a lot more options when it comes to those areas. And here I want to repeat this statement, because even though we mentioned it earlier, knowing the card interactions and knowing what's weak against what and what in general is good against everything else is really important in sealed. And this is where I think people get a lot of mileage out of it. And some really common swaps in sealed are, you built this mid-range / control deck, because that's what most seals look like, and that's going to tend to be how you want to build a sealed. It's got your good cards. You're not trying to do too focused of an aggro playing because you don't have the support for that. Sometimes you just play against someone who's got a better version of that. That just, you open a 6 out of 10 sealed, they open a 9 out of 10. When that happens, you're probably not going to win that sort of game, and sometimes you have to try to more extreme plans. So sideboarding into even like a bad aggro deck is sometimes the best plan. And
yep.
That is a frequent swap in sealed. Switching colors just so your threats line up better against their answers is very, very common. They have go Smite the Monstrous is such a good example. They have a bunch of Smite the Monstrous. You just want to switch to a color where you have good game enders. Those game enders tend to either not be creatures or be creatures that get around that, or creatures that are resilient to it somehow. And think of sideboarding as a tiebreaker. Like you said, sometimes you're you're playing red or white and you're not sure if you should splash black for this removal spell. All of a sudden you play against someone and they're green-white and you've got 2 of the self-inflicted wound, which kill a green or white creature, make them sack a green or white creature. All of a sudden that black splash just justified itself. Sideboarding is a tiebreaker when you're deciding between 2 decks, which one's going to be better against your opponents, when you're deciding whether to splash, when you're deciding whether to play a certain card or not. Sideboarding, even if it's not a specific thing, does push you towards certain things. So yes. I think using it as a tiebreaker is very important. And again, it all comes down to extracting as much information from your opponent's deck and actions as you can, and using your entire card pool to beat them, because these are the tools you have at your disposal.
Yeah, and taking what you said, and you're reiterating what we said earlier, but I do think it's really important, is that we all study this stuff. Right? We all, you're listening to a podcast right now. You probably read articles, watch draft videos. I talk to people all the time and pick their brain and just, think about these things all the time. And I think that it's short-sighted to think that all of that studying you're doing is just to learn how to draft a better deck or build a better deck in sealed. If you stop there, if you stop your using that knowledge at, well, now I know how to build a black-white deck, so I can build it in sealed, or I can draft it in draft, you're really selling yourself short. You really are, because you're putting in real time and real thought into getting these archetypes down, into understanding them. And the way that you can make up a bunch of that is by looking at what your opponent's doing, and you understand what their strategy is. And how do you take advantage of that? By sideboarding. That's how you use the rest of your cards in conjunction with how you understand what their game plan is, because you talk to your friends about it. You listen to the podcast, you read an article, maybe you wrote an article, right? You watch somebody's draft video and you kind of got a feel for what kind of draft deck they made, even if you haven't drafted it yet. And you kind of made some mental notes about how the deck plays out, what its weaknesses and strengths might be. Well, you know what? if all you do is use that to help you build your own deck, you're just selling yourself short, straight up. Because you absolutely have information about what your opponent's doing. And the best way to take advantage of that information gap that you've created is by sideboarding better than what your opponents do. So keep that in mind as well. This is Limited is a big picture. Magic's a big picture thing. What your opponent's doing is just as important as what you're doing. And just because, you've spent the time to think through how to build a deck doesn't mean you should stop the learning and the application of that there. You should also apply it to what your opponent's doing.
And look, when we talk about a level up, the idea is to level you up, is to get you more percentages in certain areas. And Magic is a game of pretty small edges. The difference in win percentage of the best player in all time and the 50th best player on the Pro Tour is just a couple percent. That's just, how these things go. I don't think, we're exaggerating when we say that learning how to sideboard both in draft and sealed, I would say more so in sealed, but even both is one of the easiest ways to just grab a couple percent, if not more. Yep. And I think that it's there for the taking, and hopefully you can, utilize it as best you can. It does take some practice. It does take thinking about things maybe a slightly different way than you're used to. And it does take not being lazy. You mentioned being lazy earlier. It's such an easy trap to fall into. Look, it's round
especially
6.
When you lose.
It's round 6 of 8. I'm down a game.
Yes.
I don't want to change my whole sealed deck again. Do I really have to? It's like, well, you don't have to. You can play your deck, but you're leaving some percentage on the table. As long as you're aware of that, then go for it. Don't just think like it'll be fine when you as an excuse. Like,
no, it's so good. That example is really good too, because if you actually put yourself in that position, you're down a game. Well, how did you lose that game? Oh, my opponent had the nut draw. I got stuck on 2 lands. I had to mulligan to 5. There's a lot of frustrating things that can happen. And we preach on this show about having a strong mental attitude and understanding the way that things work behind the scenes as far as numbers go, and not getting too caught up in any one game, that kind of stuff, right? And this is where those skills really come to fruition, because I'll tell you what, I've been in this position many, many times where you lose a frustrating game. And what do you want to do? You want to shuffle up and get back in it right now. And you do not want to get into pensive mode where you're, thinking about the 5% edge that you gain by sideboarding.
You just want to get it over with.
What's that?
You just want to get it over with.
You want to get it over with.
Like,
you just want to get back in there.
Win or lose, you just want to battle.
Right. You just want to battle. And, this is where mentally strong people who take the time to say, no, if I actually want to win this match, I'm going to have to pick up some extra percentage points here because I'm down a game, right? Like, this is not the time to throw away equity. This is the time when you need to scrape together as much of it as you can, because you got to win back-to-back games now. And yeah, so, sideboarding is just one of the ways you can do it. And it's the way we decided to talk about it here. But, there's also other things. And yeah, it all comes together, right? I mean, being good at Magic and the way that we preach on this show and stuff is a big picture view, and this is a pillar of it. It is. This is one of the major ways that you can improve your game. So hopefully you're able to do that based on this episode and other episodes as well. That will do it though for this week and our topic of sideboarding. Like Louis said, we're going to be talking about Sealed Deck next week as we kind of work our way towards a big GP. Grand Prix Atlanta is coming up in the following weekend, and that's going to be, I know a lot of our listeners are going to be there. And also just talking about sealed is something that I think, Luis, you really keyed in on when you came onto the show, about something that we need to make sure that we spend at least a show talking about. We tend to talk more about draft, but sealed's really important as it is the format that gets you wins, right? I mean, it's the GP format. It's the PPTQ format. It's the way that you get on the Pro Tour or win a Grand Prix. It is an important one. It's not as popular as draft, which is why we tend to focus a little bit more on booster draft. But sealed's super important, and it's actually quite fun as well. And it's way more skill intensive than people give it credit for. So yeah, next week we'll talk about it. That last part is a big part of my push to just talk about it more, is because there's so much ground to be gained in sealed. And yeah, I think that just in my observation, I don't class myself as one of the best sealed players, because it's just hard to get the amount of practice in that you need to be one of the best. And from watching the players who I consider the best at sealed, I bring up Owen a lot because I legitimately think that he's just the best player at sealed, because he just practices the sealed format enough and really knows how to understand it. And watching what he does and how he does it has been illuminating to me as to how much
how much you can up your win percentage in sealed by practicing more, which I think a lot of people just never gave credit for. A lot of people I know who are good had no idea about that. Yeah, I was myself one of them. So I just want to talk about it more because I think it's a kind of underserved topic.
I agree. And you can look forward to that next week. Before we take off, I want to remind you that Limited Resources is brought to you by channelfireball.com. You can go there to find all the products you need. And like I said earlier, if you want to sell some of those wares you got sitting around collecting dust and you want to trade them in, you can get 30% store credit on that from Channel Fireball off of their buy list. So make sure you check that out. If you want to find us on social media, I'm Marshall_LR and Luis is LSV. You can find everything related to the show at lrcast.com. And if you want to send us an email, it's lr@lrcast.com as well. All right, that's going to do it for this week. Thanks so much for hanging out with us. We always look forward to our time with you. And yeah, we'll talk to you next week.
So we were talking last weekend about kind of some absurd things that have happened in Magic thanks to a particular rule. And it seemed like a perfect topic here. And so the rule I'm referring to, I guess I don't know the exact number, is when you have an illegal board state or a board state that was reached by illegal means, but it's too late to correct, often it'll just the ruling is for it to stay the same.
Yeah.
An example of this, you tap 4 mana for a card that costs 5 mana, but then your opponent doesn't notice until your next turn. At that point, that card stays in play. Mm-hmm. It's too late to back up. You don't get to just return it to your hand. The ruling is that card stays in play. And this is one of the most unintuitive rules because of what it leads to. But there have been some pretty good, great instances of this happening in tournaments that I've been to or heard about. So I just want to detail exactly the absurdity that this leads to, especially since this is one of the rules that leads to the most, how did they get there board states that just couldn't actually happen.
Okay, I got to hear this.
So my first example is from GP Auckland in 2008, and this is just one of the straight up, my opponent played a spell for 5 mana when it actually cost 6. It was a Steel-Clad Serpent, which is a 6 mana 4/5 that can only attack if you have another artifact.
Okay.
Not a particularly good card, but it was playable. My opponent paid 5 for it. I played my card on their next turn. I'm like, hey, wait a minute, that costs 6, and you only have 5 mana in play. Oh, you must have played it last turn. We call the judge over. It stays in play. My opponent then declined to attack with it because he felt that it would be taking advantage of it. Passed the turn.
Interesting. I
played something, passed back, and my opponent's like, well, you could have attacked. I wouldn't have blocked. And I was just thinking to myself, yeah, but I didn't know that. And
yeah.
Because my opponent didn't tell me that. He just didn't attack with it and then said he wouldn't have blocked that after I'd already passed the turn. So
yeah.
This was actually my introduction to this rule, and the whole time I'm thinking, this is so unfair. How could this happen? But, I mean...
I bet.
It's just hard to reverse, so I'm like, all right. The next time this happened was at Pro Tour Paris when Martin Yuza played a Blightsteel Colossus. This is a 12/12 Infect, Trample, for 12. And he played it for 11 mana. It cost 12.
Yeah, it's an 11/11 Trample Infect for 12.
Oh, sorry, 11/11. So it's modeled after Darksteel Colossus, which was an original Mirrodin, and that did cost 11.
Yeah.
Martin just conflated the two cards, paid 11 for the card. Again, they did not realize till his next turn it was irreversible. And this time Martin actually did run the I'm not going to attack with this until I could have cast it. He actually passed with Blightsteel Colossus and played for 5 turns.
Because he was still finding that next land?
Because he never found the 12th. He eventually found the 12th. Basically didn't do anything for a turn, the next turn attacked with it and won the game. So he didn't have to do this, and this was at a Pro Tour.
Wow.
And he could have just attacked his opponent. But instead, he just kind of sat on his Blightsteel Colossus. So,
oh, man.
But the all-time favorite, the undefeated world champion of this instance is was at GP Brussels in 2008. It was Shadowmoor Eventide Sealed, or Shadowmoor Sealed, I guess. And there's a card called Briarberry Cohort. It's 1 and a blue for a 1/1. And it is flying. And it says if you control another blue creature, this has +1/+1. So one of the players cast a Briarberry Cohort on turn 2. 2 turns later, not 1 turn later, 2 turns later on their opponent's next turn. So again, this is a common theme here, irreversible. Both the player and the opponent realize that the player who cast Briarberry Cohort accidentally put Isleback Spawn into play.
What?
Which, even if you don't know the card, it sounds like it's pretty big. Isn't
that like 7 mana or something?
It's a 7 mana 4/8 Shroud.
Yeah, I remember this card.
If there's only 20 cards in someone's deck. So the judge gets called over. They're like, yeah, he said he played Briarberry Cohort, and then we didn't notice till his next turn he accidentally put the Isleback Spawn into play, and the judge verified the player had Briarberry Cohort in hand, because you have to watch out and make sure they're not cheating, and in this case they determined, the player just made an innocent mistake. The ruling was the Isleback Spawn stayed in play.
No. Oh, that's brutal.
That is the ruling. The fact that it's ridiculous has nothing to do with it. The rules are the rules. So this player ends up with a 4/8 Shroud in play on turn 2. That
is horrible.
The player shrugs, attacks for 4, and then plays Briarberry Cohort. And now Briarberry Cohort's a 2/2 because there's another blue creature in play.
Oh my god, that is so brutal.
So I've actually linked you to this because this was a feature match, or not a feature match. This was one of the stories that was reported from that tournament because it's just so ridiculous. But I mean, at this point, what are you gonna do? You've got this Isleback Spawn in play. You're told it's fine to have it in play. You're not getting penalized. I mean, you're getting a warning, but the Isleback Spawn's not made for not attacking.
So you just do it, right? I don't think I could. I don't think I could do it.
I don't know if I would. It does seem ridiculous to me. I'm not blaming the player who attacked because it was a legal option. They weren't trying to cheat. This just happened to happen. But
that is absurd.
If this is one of those truth is stranger than fiction moments that this game was adjudicated according to the rules. Things were ruled correctly. There was no misruling. Neither player did anything that was, cheating. It was they made a gameplay error and they got a warning. End of the day, there's an Isleback Spawn in play on turn 2. This is probably
they made a 2 mana 4/8 Shroud.
See, the thing is, you can't do it on purpose. That is cheating. But this is apparently the best way to cast Isleback Spawn on turn 2.